of reducing iron ore to pig iron or cast iron is called smelting. Iron ore is smelted in a huge cylindrical tower called a blast furnace. Here is a blast furnace and the stoves for heating air used in the furnace. Compare the size of the furnace with the railroad cars in the foreground. A blast furnace operates continuously, day and night, year after year.
You are standing 2 feet from liquid iron at 2,600 degrees. Your job is to decide when to cast it. You have no instruments. Your supervisor cannot read this. Only you can, and only by looking at it. Orange-yellow with a clean surface means the right temperature. White with turbulence means too hot. Dark and sluggish means too cold and the cast fails. You have been learning to read that color for 10 years, but the 12-hour shifts that decade cost you are documented. The man who taught you this skill died in a blast furnace explosion. His name was Joe Dubik. If you are new to Steel and Sweat, this channel covers the machines and the men of American industrial history, the things that built the country and what those things cost. Subscribe and leave a comment below with the next story you want us to dig into. This is the history of the blast furnace keeper, examined through 3 primary sources. The first is Thomas Bell's Out of This Furnace, published in 1941 by Little, Brown and Company, based on Bell's own family history in Braddock, Pennsylvania. Bell grew up in the shadow of Carnegie's Edgar Thomson Steelworks and conducted interviews with the Slovak immigrant workers his novel depicts. His blast furnace characters are grounded in documented testimony, and his book has been adopted for course use at more than 250 colleges and universities, described by historians as depicting working conditions in the early steel industry better than any historical monograph. The second source is John Fitch's The Steelworkers, published in 1910 as part of the Pittsburgh Survey produced by the Russell Sage Foundation. Fitch spent more than a year in Pittsburgh in 1907 and 1908 interviewing steelworkers and observing the blast furnace crews directly. His account is direct observation. He walked the cast house floors and spoke to the men working the tap holes, recording conditions in the terms the men themselves used. When Fitch describes the keeper's rotation schedule, he's describing something he watched rather than something he read in a company report. The third is Crystal Eastman's Work Accidents in the Law, also published as part of the Pittsburgh Survey in 1910. It documented 526 deaths in Allegheny County in a single year, of which 195 were steelworkers. These 3 sources, read together, give a precise account of what it costs to do what you are doing. But before we get to the documentation, you need to understand what the furnace is and why the cast house, your specific responsibility, is the most consequential 30 seconds in the entire operation. The blast furnace at Carnegie's Edgar Thomson Steelworks in Braddock, Pennsylvania, runs continuously. It's designed to run continuously. Once lit, it is not turned off until its brick lining wears through to the shell, a process that takes years. Stopping it before then is not safer than running it, because the contraction of cooling bricks can destroy the interior faster than operation. So the furnace runs day and night, every day, through every season, through every shift change, through every Sunday. It stands between 70 to 100 feet tall. At its core, a column of iron ore, coke, and limestone descends slowly while preheated air blasts upward from the tuyères at the bottom. The air feeds the fire. The coke burns. The carbon monoxide produced reduces the iron ore. Liquid iron, heavier than slag, collects at the furnace bottom in the hearth. But the furnace cannot hold it forever. Every 5 to 8 hours, the iron must come out. That is when the keeper calls the cast. Before the iron flows, the slag must go first. Slag is the lighter waste material that separates from the iron during smelting and floats above it in the hearth. It exits through a separate opening higher on the furnace wall, called the cinder notch, before the main cast begins. Slag is liquid stone, lighter than iron but nearly as hot. A slag runner that fails to seat correctly, or a cinder notch that opens unexpectedly during a cast, puts liquid slag on the cast house floor simultaneously with liquid iron. The keeper manages both sequences. This is another reason the job requires specific knowledge of this furnace rather than general knowledge of furnace work. You are in the cast house, the building that sits at the base of the furnace. The cast house is a long, low structure with a sand floor and an iron roof. And the wall facing the furnace tap hole is open because no wall that close to flowing liquid iron could be maintained. This is your domain in the way the locomotive cab was the engineer's domain. Everything beyond that open wall belongs to other departments. Everything inside it, in the 60 seconds around a cast, belongs to you. The sand floor is your floor. The runner channels cut into it are cut to your specifications. The timing of what flows through them is your judgment. You have been in the cast house for years. You know its sounds the way a musician knows the specific resonance of a particular instrument. You know the sound the furnace makes when the hearth is full and the pressure is building. You know the sound it makes when the iron is at the right temperature, a steady roar rather than the intermittent surging of a heat that is running too hot or the labored rhythm of a heat that is struggling. The tap hole is a hole in the furnace wall at hearth level, plugged with a clay mixture called the mud gun's charge. The clay composition must be right when the mud gun presses it in. Too dry and it crumbles before seating. Too wet, and it fails under the iron pressure building behind it. The keeper does not receive this from a printed formula. He receives it from the man who mixed it, who learned from the man before him the same way he learned to read the heat. The plug is another piece of the job that cannot be standardized without being understood first. To cast, you drill through the clay with a long steel bar, reaming it by hand until you break through into the liquid iron column. When the iron begins to flow, it runs down a channel cut in the sand floor called the runner toward the molds that receive it. What determines whether the cast is good? Temperature. And temperature is what you read by eye. How do you learn to read 2,600 degree liquid iron by its color and behavior? The same way every keeper before you learned it, by watching. By standing next to a man who already knows and studying what he sees before he acts. By asking why he waited another 10 minutes when everything looked ready, by watching what happened when someone called it too early, by remembering what failed casts feel like and sound like, by developing, over the course of a decade, a calibration between your eyes and the specific behavior of iron in this furnace, which is slightly different from the behavior of iron in the furnace in the next cast house, which runs a different burden mix on a different ore. But no instrument in 1895 can measure the iron temperature inside a working hearth with the speed and precision this decision requires. The pyrometer exists, but it is slow. And the keeper's window for decision is not slow. The knowledge required to call the cast correctly is in your eyes and your accumulated experience, and it transferred to you from the man standing beside you, and it will transfer from you to the man beside you now, if he lives long enough to receive it. Thomas Bell recorded what the schedule around this work looked like. His account in Out of This Furnace describes the blast furnace rotation this way. Kraka worked from 6 in the morning to 6 in the evening, 7 days a week, 1 week on day turn, 1 week on night. The constant shifting of turns made settlement into an energy-saving routine impossible. At the end of each day, week, came the long turn of 24 hours, when he went into the mill Sunday morning at 6 and worked continuously until Monday morning. That is the schedule. 12 hours per day, 7 days per week, rotating between day and night turns every week, with a 24-hour shift at the end of every day turn week. Why 24 hours? Because the furnace does not stop, and the shift rotation has to cross midnight somewhere. The long turn is the mechanism by which the day crew and the night crew swap their positions without either crew getting a day off. One crew works through the night, the other gets its first and last day off simultaneously. This happens every 2 weeks, without exception, for as long as you work the blast furnace. What does that schedule do to a man's body? Bell describes the consequence directly. Just when Kracha was getting used to sleeping at night, he had to learn to sleep during the day. The rotating shift made rest a skill you could never fully acquire, because the schedule removed the conditions required for recovery before you could establish them. The 12-hour day had no political justification in 1900. The steel industry's position was that the furnace required continuous operation, and continuous operation required 12-hour shifts, and therefore the schedule was a technical necessity rather than a labor policy. Fitch's Pittsburgh survey documents the steel companies making this exact argument and documents the workers' awareness that the same argument would have justified any schedule the companies chose to impose. But the argument was not entirely dishonest. What was dishonest was the implication that no alternative existed. 12 hours per shift with 2 shifts produces 24-hour coverage. 8 hours per shift with 3 shifts produces the same coverage. The 3-shift system costs more because it employs more men. The 12-hour system costs less and produces the same iron. The technical necessity argument concealed a financial preference. The men working those 12-hour turns understood this clearly because they were the ones standing in the cast house at hour 10 of a 12-hour turn, reading liquid iron at 2,600 degrees while their bodies told them things that no instrument was measuring. If you're finding this history as important as anything we have covered on this channel, go ahead and hit subscribe right now and leave a comment below with the next story you want to see. Crystal Eastman's data from the Pittsburgh survey makes the cost of that preference visible. In a single year, from 1906 to 1907, 526 men died from work accidents in Allegheny County. Of those 526 deaths, 195 were steelworkers. Eastman described what those numbers meant in terms that the official accident reports did not use. She wrote that if the year's industrial fatalities were regarded as one overwhelming disaster, in which the dead numbered 526, its most appalling feature would be that it fell exclusively on workers, breadwinners, people upon whom the world leans. Of the 526 men, 258 were married men regularly supporting their families. More than 470 children under 16 were left fatherless by the fatalities of that single year. Eastman noted that 70% of the dead were workmen of skill and training, and 80% had not yet reached the prime of their working life. Youth, skill, strength, this is what was being lost. But what killed blast furnace workers specifically? The Pittsburgh survey documents the category of iron and steel worker deaths. The causes most specific to furnace work include breakouts when liquid iron escapes the runner or the molds and flows across the cast house floor, gas explosions, when furnace gas accumulates in enclosed spaces and finds an ignition source, burns from direct contact with liquid iron or slag during a cast, and collapses when men working the furnace top lose consciousness from heat or gas exposure and fall. The gas is carbon monoxide, odorless and colorless, produced continuously by the coke combustion inside the stack. In the cast house at the moment of casting, gas concentration is at its highest. Men who worked the cast learned to move quickly and breathe shallowly. Carbon monoxide poisoning was documented in the Pittsburgh survey as a significant cause of blast furnace worker deaths. Those deaths often did not appear in official accident records because the men collapsed and were attributed to heat exhaustion rather than gas exposure. Joe Dubik, in Thomas Bell's novel, is killed in a blast furnace explosion. Dubik came to Braddock ahead of Kracha, got a job in the blast furnaces first, and introduced Kracha to the work. Bell based his cast of characters on the real Slovak immigrants his family knew, on the real accounts those men carried with them from the furnaces. When Kracha learns of Dubik's death, it falls to him to tell Dubik's wife. Bell writes that Kracha cursed his fate at having to break the horrible news. What the novel records is not a dramatic exception. It is the ordinary cost. But what did the blast furnace keeper's skill mean in this context? It means that the man with 10 years of calibrated judgment in his eyes, the man who could read a heat correctly when the margin for error was narrow, was also the man working a 24-hour-long turn once a week and standing in blast furnace gas at the moment of highest exposure. The irreplaceable and the endangered were the same man. But the campaign against the 12-hour day in the steel industry ran from the 1880s through 1923. The blast furnace department was the last to receive the 8-hour shift because companies argued most forcefully that furnace work required 12-hour continuity. The United States Steel Corporation maintained the 12-hour day in blast furnace operations years after other steel departments had shifted to 8 hours, and after the company had publicly committed to the shorter shift elsewhere. The 8-hour day for blast furnace workers finally arrived in 1923, driven by public pressure from President Harding's administration following a widely published report in 1922 documenting that the 12-hour day and the long turn persisted in American steel long after the industry had claimed to be moving toward reform. The transition happened within months once the pressure became sufficient, demonstrating that the technical necessity argument had always been an argument about cost. When maintaining the 12-hour day became more expensive than 3-shift coverage, the industry switched. The men who had built their skills under the long turn were not compensated for the years the argument had held. By 1923, the generation of men who had learned to read iron in the 1890s was middle-aged or old by steelworker standards. The knowledge they had spent 10 years acquiring was still irreplaceable. No instrument had made it obsolete. The furnace still required a keeper who could read the heat. But the men who had built that skill under the 12-hour schedule had built it at the cost that Eastman counted 195 steelworkers dead in Allegheny County in a single year and 470 children left fatherless. That was a skill that could not be written in a manual or measured by any instrument the industry was willing to install, while it was also arguing that the schedule was technically necessary. Juro Kracha, in Bell's novel, leaves the steel mill after Dubik dies. He is not driven out by the furnace directly, but by what it costs in the people. He buys a butcher shop. The knowledge he carried out of that cast house, the specific calibration between his eyes and the furnace's behavior, has no market outside the furnace. The butcher shop is not a transfer of skill. It is a retreat from a place where staying had cost too much. Bell understood this because his family had lived it. Thomas Bell's Out of This Furnace is available from the University of Pittsburgh Press. John Fitch's The Steel Workers and Crystal Eastman's Work Accidents and the Law are in the Pittsburgh Survey series at the Russell Sage Foundation Archive. If this kind of history matters to you, subscribe to Steel and Sweat. Thanks for watching.